Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Alana Kimbrell with the AAAS Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. I'm joined today by my colleague, Emily Cloyd, who will also be helping us with the chat and discussion today. We're so excited that you are joining us for this workshop on climate change conversations. This workshop will help you to think about which topics fit best in a conversation about the impacts of and responses to climate change, and help you plan to have a conversation about how science and civic society can work together to address climate change in your community. So the AAAS Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology has a vision for science and society to be in closer dialogue with one another and able to draw on each other's relevant expertise. In other words, scientists and the public have much to learn from one another. One of the programs that we run, among many, is offering workshops and seminars to scientists and engineers to help them effectively engage with the public, improving their skills and confidence. So we now offer a 3-hour workshop on climate conversations, which today is a condensed version of. We also now offer workshops to individuals who are interested in training, as well as to institutions who might want to host us for their scientists. So more information is linked in the chat from Emily about our workshop program. So today, there are 3 main points that we really hope you'll take away from our workshop about how to reach people and inspire action on climate change. So these are to focus on issues of local and personal relevance, on solutions and co-benefits of taking action that fit with your audience's values and identity, and on planting seeds of realistic hope in collective action. Research shows that most Americans are open to this conversation, and we hope you'll use this session to consider how you can engage with some of them. Before we dive in, I'll point out just 2 resources that you might find useful. So the first is our How We Respond project. The website is there on the screen, and Emily can put it in the chat as well. This is a project we launched in 2019 that shares stories from across the US, 18 different communities where scientists and the community are working together to respond to climate change. So there's a number of short videos, stories, photos, as well as a short report that summarizes the urgent problem of climate change, the ways that communities are responding, and how science can help with those responses. The website also has other resources for individuals and communities who want to take action. So following up on that project, we also created a conversation guide, and we'll share a link to that document as well in the chat. And so that is something that right now you could download to your computer and open up in Word so that you can kind of take some notes in the different sections as we walk through them today. It also has a lot of resources and links that you can reference later that you might find helpful. So let's get started. The first step in communicating about and engaging others in conversations about climate change is to think about your identity as a scientist, as a communicator, as a member of a community, as someone who wants to talk with others about climate change. So think about what you're already doing on the topic of climate change, whether it's part of your job or something you do on the side or both. What groups and connections do you already have to people who might engage with you about climate change? Perhaps you're working on a project that directly involves members of the community, and you're presenting at town hall meetings or forums. Maybe you're a member of the Rotary Club or a scout troop leader. Maybe you're on social media and are having or could have conversations there. So one example comes from a scientist we work with, Alex Vercelis, who works with farmers in Texas to improve sustainability of farming methods. And he works at a minority serving institution. So his engagement targets both farmers in the Rio Grande Valley and students in his classroom. He has been at his institution for a while, so he's built trust and relationships in the area. And he works to help set up engagement opportunities for his students to connect with the community. So related to identity, before you have that conversation with someone else, it's a good idea to have a conversation with yourself. Start by asking yourself this question: why does climate change matter to me? Spend time getting familiar with your own thoughts, emotions, assumptions, stories, and consumption habits and aspirations. So now let's all share in the chat window if you're comfortable, or jot down some notes to yourself if you prefer, why climate change matters to you. There might be many reasons, but you can just choose perhaps the first that pops to mind. So please go ahead and share that in the chat. Okay. Perhaps for some of us, we want to make the world a better place for our children. Perhaps we want a more sustainable economy. I'm not seeing responses right now in the chat, but feel free to continue to post them or think about it as the session continues. And as I said, if you prefer to jot them down in your own document, that's fine as well. But it's good to try to think about what your motivations are. All right, yes, I get a response here now. Leave a good world for our children. Thank you. Yes. All right, getting some responses. Thank you. In the interest of time, because we have a fair bit to cover and we'll have other opportunities to share in the chat later on as well. You can keep on posting if you like, but I'll move on. So returning to how you'll engage with others in conversation about climate change. Note that the communication environment around climate change and in general is very crowded, right? There's a lot of information out there and a fair amount of misinformation. So it can be hard to know what for people to focus on or what people should believe. There are also many things to think about and worry about, including climate change. So how do you cut through all of this noise and bring climate change home for people in a way that inspires sustained engagement and action? One of the first basic ways to cut through the noise is a best practice for any kind of science communication. As scientists, you're trained in the habits, cultures, and language of science. So the way you're trained to communicate is excellent for sharing precise updates with other scientists in journal articles or conference presentations, right? So you talk about what you're doing in the context of past research, you explain your methods and your results, and the smallest section at the very end is your discussion and conclusions that are breaking new ground. When you're communicating with public audiences, and by that I mean anyone who's not an expert in your field, you have to flip that science communication formula on its head. Provide the bottom line first, the most important thing you want to share. Start with that interesting new things that you found or the most important message you want to convey. Then go to why that matters and why it's relevant to them. Once you've interested your audience, you've hooked them, you can move on to discussing the important details, supporting details that matter to them, and engage in that deeper conversation, allowing their interests to guide that. So by giving people concise facts about the science is also not enough, right? So this is why we encourage what's known as public engagement with science, because just giving people information does not always change their behavior, as you might have noticed. So AAAS defines public engagement with science as intentional, meaningful interactions that provide opportunities for mutual learning between scientists and members of the public. This contrasts with the deficit model of science communication, which assumes, again, that if you give people facts to fill that information deficit, that it will alter their thinking on the issues. So a public engagement approach involves multi-directional dialogue that addresses the benefits and limits of science, responds to people's issues and concerns, and listens to and respects the public's contributions to the conversation. In this way, the public learns how science is relevant to them, and scientists learn how public knowledge and social concerns are relevant to research as well. This is a AAAS framework for engaging with the public. It can be useful in planning both longer-term engagement strategy and specific individual interactions or conversations. So today we'll walk briefly through each element of this framework and ask you to reflect on how you can use it to plan for your own conversations about climate change. So we'll start with the goal. Why are you communicating? What is it you hope to accomplish? It's important to start with your goal because that really helps determine your target audience, the messages you use to engage that audience, and ways in which you would interact. Having a specific goal will ultimately help you to evaluate your success with reaching it as well. So whatever your goal is, think about making it actionable. Informing the public and defending science from misinformation are common goals, but they do fall into that deficit model of one-way communication. So for goals to truly be public engagement goals, they should involve action. Think about why you want to inform the public. What do you want them to do in response? When you have a conversation, what do you hope comes of it? Where do you hope the conversation will go? Even if it's just that you want them to ask a question, right? The type and degree of action may vary, but it's important to think through what you hope it will be. So you might be thinking of a couple of different goals, some of which you can accomplish soon, and some might be longer term. So this is an example of how those might fit together. AAAS Leshner Public Engagement Fellow Ben Preston wanted to work with others at Oak Ridge National Lab, where he worked at the time, to increase the diversity of voices from the institution that are communicating about climate change and engage with more diverse audiences. This was his longer term goal. So in order to do that, he set a shorter term goal of creating an institute-wide communication plan for climate change. The plan sets out clear objectives, identifies audiences and communication channels. An important part of the plan was to develop the public engagement capacity and skill of the Institute's scientists. And so AAAS came to the Institute to give a communicating science workshop to help with this effort. As you think about your goals and how they fit together, I encourage you to think about them on two axes, goals that are short-term and long-term, and goals that you work on individually, and bigger picture goals that are contributing across your field or civic society. So an example of how another AAAS Leshner Public Engagement Fellow, Melissa Kenny, did that. Melissa wanted to build relationships with municipalities in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So she started by doing a listening tour to understand the scientific needs of regional and local decision makers related to increasing resilience to climate change. As part of this work, one of the activities she did was collaborate with a former mayor of College Park, Maryland, to mentor undergraduate students who synthesized science and research solutions about urban stormwater management. Such projects are a step toward better integration of the university and the surrounding communities. Over time, the listening tour and early collaborative projects like that one supported her longer term, bigger picture goals of crafting research that's relevant to local stakeholders. By engaging with local decision makers, she's also able to test her decision-making tools and processes that she's developing on the ground, making the science better. Melissa emphasizes that communities need scientists who are available to answer questions related to science-based problems and solutions, including potential climate impacts. This level of engagement requires a sustained commitment from researchers to building these long-term relationships, but it helps ensure that science has a seat at the policymaking table. So as you plan your communication, consider how your goals might overlap with the goals of the individuals and communities you're hoping to engage. This goal alignment is a critical aspect of public engagement. For example, you can consider how to connect the issue of climate change overall to a community's search for solutions on specific problems of flooding or extreme heat. Perhaps there are conversations and activities being led by local governments or community organizations that you can contribute to. Remember that public engagement is a two-way street. So as you build relationships with your audience, think about ways that both you and they are benefiting. This may end up taking your engagement and perhaps even your research in some different directions. Now it's your turn to think about your goals for public engagement about climate change. So why do you want to engage with the public on climate? Try to go deeper than saying something like, I want people to know about my research, or I want people to understand the reality of climate change. Think about what you want people to do with the information that you share. Why are you sharing it, and what actions do you hope people will take? So again, you can share this now in the chat, in the Q&A section of the virtual platform. We'd love to hear from some of you about what your thoughts are at this point, even if you just want to choose one idea for what you hope to achieve by having climate conversations. Give you a moment to think about this. Okay, so I see a response here. Someone wants to help generate or local activities to respond to climate change. That's great. I think acting within your local community is a great way to take some action. And again, in our How We Respond website that we shared, the How You Respond webpage has ideas for individuals and communities for what kinds of actions you might want to take. And the stories that are shared there also have different ideas of different kinds of responses. Okay, All right, we got another response. Motivate people to talk to their legislators about the need for climate action. Great, yes. So encourage not just yourself to reach out to your legislator, but get others to do it as well. Thank you. All right, thank you so much for your responses. I'm going to move along. So feel free to keep on sharing though, and Emily can also monitor the Q&A there in case there are questions. So now that you have your goal in mind, perhaps, it's time to think about who you will be communicating or engaging with. Who are the audiences that can help you to reach your goal? If you have a specific short-term goal, the audience might be fairly obvious, but if you have a bigger picture or longer-term goal, sometimes it's harder to define your audience. So in this case, it might be helpful to just choose a very specific audience based on who has meaning for you, like a local school group or civic organization that you are aware of or already involved with. You're more likely to be successful with your goal if you define your audience narrowly, even if it changes later. So as you're thinking about the audience that you want to engage, let's dive into how Americans as a broader audience think about climate change. So about 7 in 10 Americans think that climate change is happening. And about 6 in 10 understand that climate change is mostly human caused. By contrast, 3 in 10 think it's mostly due to natural changes in the environment. In contrast, 97% of scientists agree that climate change is happening and is mostly human caused. About 2/3 of Americans say they are at least somewhat worried about climate change. 30%, represented by the purple dots here, are very worried about it. This number is continuing to rise. Let's look a bit more at people's concerns about climate change. Americans are most likely to think that plant and animal species and future generations of people will be harmed a moderate amount or a great deal by climate change. More Americans think that people in developing countries will be harmed than people in their community, and the fewest think that they themselves will be harmed. So this highlights the importance of including the impacts of climate change at the local personal level in conversations. So support for responses and solutions is actually quite high among American adults. This is one of the reasons why it's useful to focus on solutions. So using the data that we've just reviewed and some additional survey responses about people's beliefs, concerns, and motivations to take action on climate change, researchers have identified 6 categories that can be useful in thinking about audiences you might engage with on climate change. So the alarmed, 31%, are fully convinced of the reality and seriousness of climate change and are already taking some individual, consumer, and political action to address it. The concerned, which is 26%, are also convinced that climate change is happening and a serious problem, but have yet to really engage the issue personally. 3 other groups, the cautious, disengaged, and doubtful, represent different stages of understanding and acceptance of the problem, and none are actively involved. The final group, dismissive, which is 10% here, are very sure that human-caused climate change is not happening and are actively involved as opponents of efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So as you can see, the majority of Americans fall into the alarmed and concerned categories. And overall, 3/4 fall into alarmed, concerned, and cautious. So today, we will focus more on engaging those groups that are more open to conversations, and we'll spend less time focusing on how to counter the dismissive category, who stridently deny the facts of climate change and are unlikely, based on the research, to change their mind. So let's look at one last result from the Climate Change in the American Mind report that we've been reviewing here. So even though a majority of Americans are alarmed or concerned about climate change, about 6 in 10 say they rarely or never discuss climate change with family and friends. And only about 4 in 10 say they do so occasionally or often. So a majority of Americans say the issue of climate change is personally important, yet rarely hear about it from their friends and families. We know from science communication and behavior research that when the message comes from close friends and family, people less engaged with the issue may be more receptive than when the identical message is communicated by someone not part of their close social network. Thus, there may be, in part, lower climate policy support because people may mistakenly believe that other important people in their lives do not care about climate change. So this leads us to the question of how we can have a productive conversation. So Ben Preston, who we mentioned earlier, suggests starting with what they, the community, value, what their responsibilities are, what their jobs are, what they care about, and then figure out how climate change influences that. So as you think about your audience, consider how their views about climate might be shaped by a wide variety of factors, right? So beliefs about the reality of climate change are affected not just by their science education and knowledge, but also political ideology, age, religious affiliation, gender, ethnicity, geography, socioeconomic background, and other factors like personal experience with extreme weather. If you'd like to learn more about the ways in which attitudes about climate change vary by location, there are great visualizations at the Yale Climate Communication website. So at this site, you can see how Americans' climate change beliefs, risk perceptions, and policy support vary at the state, congressional district, metro area, and county levels. And you can zoom in to see the data at these different levels and locations. So this visualization shows the percentage of adults in each county of the US that think their local officials should do more to address climate change. And you can change the question on the website to see different questions. So it's also important to consider how the characteristics and history of a community might influence how community members perceive you. So this is from an example from Savannah, Georgia, that we highlighted in our How We Respond project. And as Dawood Shabaka explains in the full video that you can watch on our website, Emily can share the link to the video as well in the chat. It's about 5 minutes long. The community had negative experiences with scientists in the past who sought community buy-in for research, but never shared results of that research. When scientists from Georgia Tech approached leaders from Harambe House about participating in a project to install sea level rise sensors and build an emergency response network, however, things changed. By talking with Dawood and others about what they hoped to do, how the community could be a part of the project, and ensuring that the community had access to the data, scientists and community members were working together to understand how sea level rise was impacting the community, and also what other concerns the community had that the scientists and the university could help with, such as air quality. So turning back to you, who is your audience? If you haven't chosen one already, here are some ideas to get you started. If you're struggling, again, you can think about who you're already connected with, like campus community groups or neighborhood groups, exercise classmates, church acquaintances, family, etc. Keep your goal in mind as you identify your audience. And again, the more specific you are, the more easily and accurately you can tailor your conversation to their needs and interests and values. So let's pause for a moment for you to think about this. Who is your audience and how do you want to, what do you know about them already? How can you learn more about them? What are their values, interests, priorities, strengths, needs? So again, also think about what you want your audience to do as a result of your conversation. What actions do you want people to take? So I encourage you to think about this and take a few notes and perhaps share an audience or two in the chat as well. Okay. Sometimes there's a bit of a delay here, so I'm going to wait another moment to see if there's some ideas about audiences that you might engage with about climate change.
Yeah, there's about a 15 or 20-second delay between when Alana is giving the presentation and it makes it over to the platform. So
okay.
Apologies if it seems a little bit out of sync, but I'm also in the chat and watching what's happening as well.
Thank you, Emily. And again, this is something you can do in that conversation guide worksheet. There's spots for you to jot down notes in these different sections, so you can work on this more later if you wish. go back up to this slide, give people some other ideas again. Okay, well, I'm gonna move along and to the next section of our framework here. So now that you have thought a bit about goal and audience, the next key component of your engagement is your messages that you'll use as part of your conversation. So AAAS uses the 3 M's of message method to distill complex information into a clear and streamlined structure. You can do this by making sure your messages are miniature, memorable, and meaningful. So a miniature message means that it makes it easy for you to remember and for your audience to remember. Think of this as your outline, a few words or brief phrases that you can quickly recall, making sure you hit all your key points in a conversation. So to make your messages miniature, think of what essentials you would write on an index card, keep in your back pocket perhaps during a speech. What are the 3 main important points that you want your audience to remember and respond to? And organize your message around these points. So here are some miniature messages that we use in creating how we respond. Each is about a sentence long, although they could be shortened to a few words. And so using this scaffolding, you can also expand the conversation using specifics for the community you're speaking with. What are the threats and problems that climate change poses to them? How are community members and scientists already working together there to respond? And what are the specific climate and economic or community benefits of responding? So next, you want to think about making your message memorable. And there are a variety of ways that you can do this. Memorable messages help you to stay on message and helps your audience to remember your message long after your encounter. So you can use alliteration, similar sounds, analogies. Pop culture references can be useful, although you make sure that they're appropriate references for your audience. And of course, stories. So here's an example of using alliteration in a high-level message from the AAAS What We Know report, which preceded our How We Respond project. It highlighted the reality of climate change, the risks it poses to the US, and the scientific support for responding to climate change sooner rather than later. So finally, you want your messages to be meaningful, of course. You want to really focus on what will matter to your audience. Stories in particular are easier for people to remember and digest and create meaning from than simple lists of facts. So they're a very powerful messaging tool. You can draw on your own emotions as well, your passion, frustration, excitement, and the emotions of your audience. You can also make your messages meaningful to people by using visuals. For example, this graphic shows how temperatures have changed in the US over the past century, with warmer temperatures occurring much more frequently in recent years, as shown by the red stripes. One other consideration with your messages is jargon, technical terms that have special meaning to you and your technical peers and help you to go about your business efficiently and with precision. Jargon can be off-putting, though, to audiences who aren't familiar with these terms. Adults, especially, as opposed to kids, might be too embarrassed to ask questions or can easily get lost in your language without letting you know. So when you change your terminology and don't use jargon, sometimes there's a bit of, you feel there's a bit of loss of precision, but you can still be accurate. And so it's just finding your comfort level there. These are a few specific jargon terms related to climate change and suggestions for other words you might use to better convey the ideas. So for example, instead of saying anthropogenic climate change, you can say human caused. And terms like positive feedback can be confusing to people because for them, it might mean getting positive feedback from your boss, right? So vicious cycle might be more useful. So let's turn to some suggestions for messages and discussion topics that are recommended for different groups in the 6 Americas. So for the alarmed and concerned, we suggest providing information about solutions that are feasible and effective, and focus on building that sense of efficacy, that sense that what they do can make a difference, to complement their already high risk perceptions and motivate them to take action. You might also encourage these groups to discuss the issue more with friends and family, right? Promoting more opinion leadership on the issue. For the cautious and disengaged, can create content that overcomes a lack of motivation by drawing them into the conversation using visual imagery, humor, highly credible sources, and promote positive social norms by showing that climate-friendly behaviors are popular and commonplace and respected. You can also personalize the threat, right, by showing impacts on places that are physically close or emotionally significant to them, and on people who the audience can identify with. For the doubtful and dismissive, less confrontational, more indirect approaches work best, as direct communication might trigger argument. Emphasizing scientific agreement on the reality of climate change might help the doubtful become less skeptical, but this is unlikely to work with the dismissive, who are highly motivated to reject scientific information that disagrees with their views and are distrustful of climate scientists. Health frames showing how climate change affects public health have been shown to have some resonance with all of these segments. So another useful tactic is to create messages that address both the threat of climate change while also building the belief that what they do can make a difference. So this is an example from one of our How We Respond stories as well, about creating and using biochar in Wyoming and Nebraska. So this message starts by framing the specific threat of climate change in reducing the ability of crops to absorb nutrients and making the soil drier. From there, it introduces an action. Adding biochar, a plant-based charcoal created from agricultural and forestry waste, to the soil can increase moisture and nutrients available to crops. Then goes on to also discuss other climate-related benefits of biochar, like reducing carbon dioxide and methane emissions from cattle when added to their feed. So I'll also note that this is a story about one person's entrepreneurship and their personal motivation to make the world a better place for their kids, and also to have a viable business. So this threat plus action approach ties into one of our 3 central points. Whenever you talk about climate change, talk about feasible and effective solutions. So this is Tana Marie Surgeon-Rogers, who manages a coastal wetland research reserve in Cape Cod, from another How We Respond story. She collaborates with state and local government and other nonprofits to restore the Herring River estuary and quantify the greenhouse gases it absorbs. So in the video about Herring River, she notes that being solutions-oriented is key for her to maintaining hope and remembering that whatever you're doing is part of making a difference in this world. So providing that realistic hope and discussing the benefits of collective action is important. There are both small and big changes underway across the US and around the world. For example, in many places, renewable energy is becoming cheaper than fossil fuels. Texas is 25% renewable. And we include stories from How We Respond, or in How We Respond, from a military base and several houses of worship in Texas that are making these changes. So we encourage you to find some pieces of good news that speak to the values of the audience you're talking with and incorporate those into your conversation. So thinking about your messages, start again by thinking of 3 words or phrases or short sentences, keeping your goal and audience and their values, interests, and concerns in mind. Then how would you develop these key points into something you can use in dialogue? How will you connect to the issues and concerns that are relevant for your audience? What actions or solutions might you include in your conversation? So feel free now again to share some ideas about your messages. This does not need to be, of course, polished, but a few key ideas that you're hoping to convey in a conversation with your audience that you have in mind about climate change.
So while people think about those messages, I've dropped in the chat links to several of the community stories that Alana mentioned. And I've also dropped in a link to resources for individuals and communities interested in taking action on climate change. And many of those have some messages that have worked for specific audiences or specific areas of the country.
Great, thank you, Emily. Yeah, part of our goal with that project was really to show some examples of different ways of responding in different types of communities and how they did that. So give some ideas for folks. All right, so again, the idea here is just to start with jotting down a few bullet points, really, that later, you can flesh out into more of a conversation. But these few bullets can be useful in a really short engagement or in a longer one that you build out depending on who your audience is. All right, I'm getting a few responses in the chat. Thank you so much. And we only have less than 10 minutes left, so I am going to move on. We have a few more things to cover here. So once you've considered your goal, audience, and message, of course, you want to turn to the actionable part, right? The actual engagement. So maybe you have a type of engagement scenario or conversation in mind. But if not, this section might help you to think about different ways to do that. So there are many ways to engage in dialogue about climate change, ranging from conversations with your friends and family to writing op-eds or social media posts to collaboratively developed research projects and community climate action plans. So, we're going to take a closer look at a few of these. So casual conversations is something that, many scientists is a frequent way that they engage about climate change. So this example is actually from my colleague Emily here. So she went on a bike and kayak tour of trees around DC. And as they were eating their lunch, people in the group started talking about how the cherry blossoms seemed to come earlier every year and how hot temperatures stretched later into the fall. So right there was a great opportunity for her to talk about how climate change is affecting their city. Community dialogues provide space for a conversation about how climate change intersects with other issues people care about. For example, in Phoenix, Arizona, and Marquette, Michigan, these are examples of scientists, government agencies, and community organizations working together to organize listening sessions and focus groups so that people could share about climate change, social justice, health, economic concerns, and more, and start collaboratively planning for the future. In the Gentilly neighborhood of New Orleans, residents used iSeeChange, a citizen science platform, to collect data on flooding, and their observations helped change the actual indicators being used by city planners to inform their green infrastructure development, reduce flooding, and identify urban heat islands. So this is just one example of how to share resources, data, and observations in a multi-directional way that values local knowledge. So we're not going to pause really here, but just think about different ways that you might engage. What conversations are already taking place in your community and how might you join those? What new opportunities do you want to create? And who might you partner with on this? So the last section of our framework focuses on evaluation, how you will know whether you're succeeding in your climate change goals or climate engagement goals. So you can do some evaluation during your engagement activities, starting with audience feedback. So that's something that's immediate and ongoing and consists of things like assessing your audience's body language, what questions or lack of questions, and their general participation in the conversation. So as an example, do these children look like they're engaging in this activity? Children on the left seem bored and the child on the right is much more excited, right, and engaged. So it might be time to ask some questions of the children on the left to re-engage them in the activity. You can also take a step back and reflect on your conversation and your experience. So each time you have a conversation about climate change, ask yourself, how did I do? What went well? What should I change? Did I accomplish my goal or work towards my goal? Should my goal, audience, message, or way of engaging change? And finally, you might want to conduct a more formal evaluation of your engagement activity if it's a bigger kind of project or program. Sorry. So a formal evaluation can be done in many ways and could include both the scientists and the community members who are involved in the activities. So this can help you understand whether you're meeting your goals and what actions happen as a result of your engagement. So now it's time to reflect on what might be your next steps. We've talked about your goals, audience, message, and the kinds of conversations and activities that you want to join or organize. So we can think for a moment now about what you might do to start making some of these things happen. It's helpful to be as specific as possible with your timeline and your list of actions and how you will measure your success. So now I'm going to pause. We have a few more minutes in this session, and I just want to ask if anyone has any other questions that they want to pose in the chat. You can do that now, and we'll do our best to kind of quickly respond to them. Or if you would like to share perhaps any thoughts about what next steps you'd like to take, we'd be happy to hear those.
Alana, I wanted to point out a couple other resources that AAAS has based on what folks have mentioned in the chat. There are a number of people who said that their audiences are local or state policymakers or the constituents of those policymakers. So I put in a link to AAAS's local science engagement network. And that program actually works with scientists to connect them with policymakers to talk about climate change and other issues where science can help be a part of the dialogue in society. And there was also a comment about someone who is working primarily with communities of faith and in the Episcopal community to use a carbon tracker and to look at how people of faith might respond to climate. So I put a link to last year's Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion chat between Catherine Hayhoe and the Episcopal bishop about the work that they've done on climate change.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Catherine Hayhoe has a lot of resources and inspiring talks about engaging with people of faith. So that's a really good example of that lecture.
I think there's another good question here, which is, where are scientists struggling in the process of engaging with the public? So this person says in particular, they find getting over the deficit model is a difficult step.
Yeah, I think that it is really difficult, even when you're thinking to yourself that you want to do it and you start trying to make that mental shift and leap. It's hard to actually change how we communicate. And I think that one of the best things to focus on is really listening. So trying to think about, so you want to create your own message for what you want to share with your audience, but you also really want to focus on just hearing what your audience's concerns are, listening to where they're coming from and why they're coming from that perspective. I think that's a really important part of shifting to a more dialogue-based engagement. Emily, do you have anything else to suggest on that?
No, I think that's a great point. And I think really just being in conversation with your colleagues in science about this and talking about the importance of bringing in all of the different expertises that people have in the community is a really good way to get started in that conversation and overcome some of that hurdle.
Yeah, starting to really understand what you might learn from your audience and not just sort of trying to respect them in sort of a check the box sort of way, but like actually really understand what your public can offer and what strengths they have, so that you can learn from them. Great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And I'm going to share here our Twitter handles and our links again to the How We Respond project and our workshops program. And we're really glad that you joined us today. Thank you so much.